Okay, so yeah, I guess this is getting recorded, so some people might be watching it back on YouTube. So of course, feel free to kind of get in touch with myself or the organisation I work with afterwards if any of the issues that I discuss are something that you'd want to explore more or something that you might want support around as well. So I called this wee session Mary, Jane and Mandy, Women, Drugs and What You Need to Know. I think that it's quite an interesting phenomenon that a lot of the time the kind of street names or slang names for drugs are actually women's names. So Mary Jane obviously referring to cannabis historically, and Mandy in the UK is often where we would call MDMA, the active ingredient that is in ecstasy tablets. So a little bit about me. My name's Kira. I currently work at the Scottish harm reduction charity Crew. I've worked there for around 7 years, maybe a bit longer, in various different roles. Currently, I'm the training and communications officer. So Crew exists to reduce drug-related harm, and we are part of a wider network of harm reduction organisations working in nightlife settings called NUNET. And I am, in addition to being the training comms officer at Crew, I also volunteer with lots of different organisations who are working in harm reduction as well. For example, The Loop, which is an organisation doing drug testing, drug checking at festivals and city centres in England. And I'm also on the board of Scottish Families Affected by Alcohol and Drugs, which is an organisation set up to support people who might be affected by someone else's drug use. And so that's family in the very widest sense of the word. If you're affected by someone who's close to use drug use, then you can access that service. So just to highlight those there. A little bit about Crew and what we do. So Crew, as I said, is a national charity, so we work across the whole of Scotland, but we're mainly based in Edinburgh. So this is a wee picture of our city centre drop-in. This is a place where people can come and get non-judgmental and credible information about drugs. They can also access free safe sex materials. It is somewhere where people can come and get resources, information resources about various different topics, specific information about drugs. They can access pregnancy testing, and they can access blood-borne virus testing, so that's testing for hepatitis and HIV. We are obviously not operating our normal services at the moment due to COVID, so do have a wee look on our website to check what's available now. There's certain things that we can offer to everyone and certain things we can only offer to people who've already engaged in our services before. Crew was started in 1992 as a response to increased drug use in Scotland. So a group of young people in Edinburgh saw that there was a bit of an uptick in the number of people who were taking drugs, a little bit around the time of rave culture emerging, and they thought, there's just no information about drugs. There's no good information about drugs, but there's just no information, full stop. So they took it upon themselves to create some. So they started handwriting information about drugs, photocopying it and handing it outside raves and other nightlife spaces where young people were. Fast forward more than 25 years later, and here we are as a kind of national charity. We also offer a counselling service. So anyone over the age of 18, who currently we're offering it to people who are based in Edinburgh for face-to-face services, and that will be expanding as we look more at online options, kind of spurred on by the global pandemic. But anyone over 18 can access up to 30 free counselling sessions to kind of chat about their drug use. You can see here in this little slide an example of some old flyers that we had, and then a little bit about how we work now. So people can come to Crew at any point in their journey, at any point where they want to change their relationship with the drugs that they're taking. They might just get information, they might get some specific directed harm reduction information for them and the way they take drugs. They might access our counselling, and they might just be looking for ongoing support after they've kind of made changes to their relationship with drugs. We don't ask that people intend to stop taking drugs, and we don't ask that people even have an intention to stop taking drugs, just that they want to create a healthier relationship with the drugs that they take. And they can get that really amazing kind of opportunity to have 30 free sessions. This is quite unique, the number of sessions that are offered to people across mental health services in general. If anyone's tried to access mental health support in Scotland, you'll know generally you get about 6 weeks of counselling. The reason we can do that is because we focus on a really specific kind of niche focus of stimulant drugs, or drugs that might be known as party drugs, drugs that are used in recreational settings, such as cocaine, MDMA, ketamine, cannabis, rather than things like heroin or Valium or alcohol. So if somebody was taking that drug and it was their main drug of choice, they get referred to another drug service. So Crew's got loads of volunteers as well, so normally what we were doing across the summer is we were going to events like Pride, we were going to festivals, and we'd be having a wee stall giving people harm reduction information and providing free safe sex materials. As I mentioned, we're part of a wider international family of organisations working in this same way. And we are funded by the Scottish Government, supported by NHS Lothian, and also partnered with Healthy Respect, which is a sexual health initiative in Edinburgh and the Lothians. We also hold an LGBT charter mark, the bronze level. That's quite an important thing that we have, because it makes sure that all of our services are accessible, are welcoming, and are inclusive of people of any gender identity and any sexual orientation. And we feel that's a really important thing for a drug service to embody, because often people who are part of the LGBT community might be at greater risk from problematic drug use, and often the first place that someone might be comfortable being out and open about their gender identity or sexual orientation is in a nightlife space, where it's much more likely they might be drinking alcohol or taking other drugs. A little bit of an overview, just the kind of drugs that people come to Crew for. Cannabis is generally kind of been the most common one over the past 25 years. Cocaine is kind of increasing a little bit. MDMA is generally quite steady. And you can see there's the blue line that says NPS. That's something that we would have referred to as legal highs when they were being sold in shops, if anyone remembers that time when drugs were being sold in shops. They got banned, under control in 2016, so we don't see people coming to our service about those drugs anymore. When we think about who's coming to our services, I've changed the way that we monitor it, so we can't compare like to like over the past 3 years, but we can see that generally it's around 21 to 24% of our clients are women, and a small proportion identify as trans, with the majority of people who come to our services being male. This is something that is mirrored across most drug services, across most countries in Europe and internationally, and we can discuss a few of the reasons why that happens as well. So why should we focus on women and gender non-conforming people? Why should we do that when actually there's a smaller percentage of people who are coming to our service? Well, the very fact that there's a smaller number of people coming to our service is one reason why we should focus on women and gender non-conforming people. Women make up approximately a quarter of all people with serious drug problems, and around 1/5 of all entrants to drug treatment in Europe. And according to the EU Agency for Drugs, they're particularly likely to experience stigma, economic disadvantage, have a substance using partner, children who may play a central role in their drug use and recovery, and have experienced sexual and physical abuse. And that's quite an important thing to remember, that women who are taking drugs are going to be at a economic disadvantage, but also may have an increased trauma history when we're thinking about problematic drug use. One reason that we need to focus on this in Scotland as well is that the number of women who have died after taking drugs has increased by 189% in the 10-year period between 2008 and 2018. That's a huge jump in a 10-year period. The Scottish Government has kind of explored, why is that happening, and I'll kind of look at that as well. But across the board, in Scotland, we have a very high drug-related death rate. So our drug-related death stats are always a year behind. So in the summer of 2019, we have the results for 2018. So in the summer of 2020, we should have the results for 2019. But obviously, given the global pandemic, we're a little bit behind. So we're still talking about 2018. But in 2018, 1,187 people died after taking drugs in Scotland. So that is a really high number in comparison to other European countries. 72% of those were male and the rest were female. So we also, when we compare ourselves to other European countries, the ratio of women who die after taking drugs in Scotland is generally a little bit higher. We have, for the past few years, sat around 75%, 25% women, whereas many other countries it's more like 85%, 95% men and the rest women. So we've seen a big increase over the past 10 years in the number of people who die after taking drugs, and it's been increasing year on year since 1996, going in the opposite direction. We also are much higher than any other European country. So this little graph here just shows how much higher we are than any European country. So the purple bars on the graph is representing data from 2017. So if you can compare our 2017 data, we're way ahead of any other European country. If we take into account our 2018 data, we're much higher as well. And that is thought to increase when we get the most recent figures as well. So the Scottish Government tried to look at, what are the reasons that women are dying, more women in the past 10 years are dying after taking drugs. They looked at things like, are we recording things differently? Are there just more women in general who are dying? Is there more women taking drugs? Is it because women have got different mental health issues? What else is it? Is it trauma? Is it experiences of prison? Is it other social trends? And they tried to look at what was causing this. And so actually what they found is, yes, so there's more women who are older who are taking drugs, but we have to remember that older means over the age of 35. So there's more women who are over the age of 35 who are taking drugs, and that's at an increased risk. There's changes to the way that women take drugs, so people are taking different kinds of drugs, and there's increased polydrug use, which is a term we refer to when people mix different drugs. There's a greater experience of social isolation, so there's changes in the roles that women have in society, which is thought to contribute to it. But one thing is an example of the trauma of having children taken into care. There's also changes to the welfare system that have happened over the past few years, which actually make women more vulnerable in our society. And so those are one of the key factors that we think have contributed to this as well. There's a general worsening of mental health issues in deprived areas where problematic drug use is more common. There's changes to support services, the services people can access, the way they can access them. Drug services often aren't directed towards the needs of women, and also another contributing factor is women's experience of the criminal justice system. So when we look at it, actually a lot of these factors are things like women being in relationships where abuse exists, coercion, control, domestic violence. Also another risk factor is women being involved in sex work, women who have a history of trauma, and that might be trauma sustained throughout childhood and into adulthood, experience of mental illness, and also cuts to services, cuts to budgets, cuts to local services, cuts to the opportunities that women might have to get involved in support, and also things like employability programs and so on. So all of these have maybe come together to lead to that increase. And so for those reasons, I think we can maybe all agree that actually drug use is a feminist issue as well. When we're seeing a nearly 200% increase in the number of women dying in a 10-year period, and we can look at all these different kind of socioeconomic factors, we can understand it to be a feminist issue. If we look to our kind of wider colleagues that I'm connected with, we can actually talk about this idea of like narco-feminism, and looking at steps that we can take to improve the outcomes for women who take drugs. So we also have to remember that this is an intersectional kind of issue as well. So we need to remember that things like class, things like culture, ethnicity, race, and access to education, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on will all come together to either increase a woman's risk of taking drugs, or to add in protective factors that might reduce that risk. Just going to highlight a few books that might be of interest to kind of explore some of those topics around the criminal justice system, race and gender identity. So the first book is Eve Was Framed by Helena Kennedy, which just explores women and the British justice system, and how actually sometimes women will have a very different experience in the criminal justice system, which increases this experience of trauma and social violence. Feminism Interrupted is a book that was just published at the start of this year, and has a really amazing kind of overview of lots of different subjects relating to feminism, but in particular focuses on the idea of the criminal justice system and drug use and so on. There's this other book, Lady Sings the Blues, which is the history of Billie Holiday, which looks quite specifically into the history of the idea of criminalizing people who take drugs, and how this is very much linked to the kind of demonization of a woman who was at the head of the civil rights movement in America at the time. And then this final book, Clean, by Juno Dawson, is the experience of a trans woman who experienced kind of problems with drugs throughout her life. So that was just to highlight those books if anybody wants to go and read them. I'm not being sponsored by these authors at all. I just think these are useful books to challenge your thinking about some of these topics and look into them a bit more. Just to kind of have a think as well about this idea of why a gendered analysis of these issues is important. So this is just a little excerpt from a Case for Gendered Analysis of Violence Against Women, which is a document prepared by the Scottish Government. So we're quite good at looking at things through a gendered analysis in Scotland. So this idea that gender refers to socially constructed roles, it's things like attitudes, behaviours, responsibilities, relative power, status and influence that might be ascribed to masculine or feminine presenting people, highlighting that these are changeable over time, and actually social structures and mechanisms will affect our everyday lives depending on our gender identity. It's the way that we're perceived and how we're expected to think and act. I think that's quite nice there. Women and men are made, not born. So we should take this idea of gendered analysis into any kind of thoughts that we're having about drug use as well, and in general, any kind of social issues that are facing women and gender non-conforming people is quite important to kind of look at there. So unless we take seriously the ways in which sex difference has been used to systemize subordination, we cannot get to grips with the normalized possibility of violence and abuse in gender relations. And I think this is something that we should bear in mind whenever we're thinking about drug use. And we can have this whole spectrum of different ways in which people take drugs. It's estimated that 3 billion people will take drugs in any given year across the world. And between 90 and 95% of those people will not experience any problems with the drugs that they take. They won't end up in hospital, they won't need support from a drug service. So when we're talking about problematic use, this actually represents a very small proportion of the population of people who actually take drugs. So there is a wide spectrum of people who are taking drugs in different ways with different impacts on their life. So not all drug use is problematic, but we have to recognise that sometimes it will be. This is a kind of a little bit of data from an amazing organisation based in Spain called Mercenarios. So they have looked at some of the women and non-binary people who come to their service, and what are the issues that are going on for them. So around 60% of the women who come to their services have got problems relating to their drug consumption. Actually, for around 20%, they have issues that is relating to racial discrimination. 20% to their LGBT identity, another 20% because they are involved in sex work, and then we can see around 70% of the people accessing their services issues with housing as well, and then a third might have issues with imprisonment. So I think that's quite an interesting overview from their service. It's a specifically women and non-binary focused service, and they are really designed as well to assist women who are escaping any kind of social violence, especially domestic violence. And then when they look a bit deeper, they look into the experience of women in their childhood, and half of them have experienced some kind of physical violence, often sexual violence as well, family breakdown, and being criminalised or experiencing LGBT phobia. So it's really important to think about these different factors that are going on for women. Other key issues that we could think about is pregnancy and parenting women, women who are involved in sex work and within that maybe experiencing violence and increased stigma, people who are from ethnic minorities who might have been trafficked, and women who are in prison. In general, we should also think about the stigma that people who take drugs experience. So research suggested the media conveys a mainly negative impression that demonises and marginalises people who take drugs, misrepresents people who take drugs, drug use and its effects. And 64% of the UK population believe that people with a history of drug dependence are too often demonised in the media. And this is especially true of women. If we think of the kind of archetype of a woman who is drunk as it's represented in the media, we will most often think of this kind of iconic image of a woman drunk on a bench. Quick Google search can find nearly 5,000 images of drunk women on a bench. This became the kind of symbol of increased consumption of alcohol in the ladette time of the 2000s of women. So this is the representation. But this kind of increased social stigma for women who drink alcohol or take other drugs goes way back to ancient Greece, when actually there was the kind of sect of people who worshipped Dionysus. He's equivalent of the Roman god of Bacchus, representative of wine and madness. So this was when women would, for once, when they were supposed to be presenting a very specific kind of persona in society and had a very specific role in society, when they took part in worship rituals for this god, they would drink and dance and generally shed the kind of perceptions of what it meant to be a woman in Greek society. And you can see here a quote written about the women at the time who were said to roam barefoot and be wild in the mountains. I hear about disgusting things going on here in the city, women leaving home, going to silly Bacchic rituals, cavorting there in the mountain shadows. So this was the first kind of documented idea of women who liked to alter their state of consciousness, being kind of seen as immoral or bad. We can go back as well to the 1700s when spirits first came to the UK, and gin in particular was referred to as mother's ruin. And you can see here this kind of sketch by Hogarth, who was a satirist in the 1700s. We've got the respectable people on one side in Beer Alley, and then down in Gin Lane we have a woman who is so drunk on gin she is literally dropping her child off the side of the stairs, because that is what this would do. It would make women destitute and neglect their children. Fast forward, and actually we can go to the 60s. This was a really popular book, the biggest selling novel of 1966, which told the story of these women who had various different interactions with drugs and various different dependencies on different prescription and non-prescription drugs. And this was very much presented as a unique kind of issue with women, that they were relying on these drugs. So if anyone's interested, you can kind of look at that book and film, which is in the 60s. And then we fast forward to now, and we can see that actually a lot of the kind of stigma has been reinforced. So often women won't access drug services because there's increased social shame, increased stigma. They might worry about their children being removed from their care. There might be coercion and control going on when a woman is taking drugs as well. Women are much more likely, heterosexual and bisexual women are much more likely to be introduced to taking drugs by a male partner, and very often there's a power dynamic involved there, which can lead to coercion around their drug use, or even maybe being forced to sell drugs or to sell sex to pay for drugs. And harm reduction services. So when we talk about a harm reduction service, it's something that is providing any opportunity for people to reduce the harm from drugs they take. So that might be things like access to clean needles, it might be things like access to counselling, to prescriptions that assist them. So harm reduction services worldwide remain overwhelmingly gender blind, or more commonly male focused. So women aren't getting specific interventions that fit their needs, that actually take into account all those experiences of social violence and trauma that we looked at in the previous slides. And now we talk about alcohol in particular in a very different way. So now that gin that used to be referred to as mother's ruin is seen as something that independent women will do. Gin-dependent women are people who can make their own choices about their alcohol consumption. And you can see here this little screenshot of this idea of alcohol companies using Women's Day, International Women's Day, to sell more drinks to women. But yeah, women take drugs, and that's a fact. Women do take drugs, we need to deal with it. This is a little video though that kind of highlights why we should be paying a bit more attention to the risks that women might experience. So let's see if this is going to load, and if not, I will stop sharing my screen temporarily, and I have a little video file that I prepared earlier. So I shall stop from The Guardian. And I'll just play a few minutes of it.
Whenever I knew she was going out anywhere, whether it just be clubbing down the road, it was always to stay safe, have a good time, dance and come home.
Ecstasy deaths have quadrupled in the last 5 years. This year so far, at least 10 young women have died after taking ecstasy, compared to 4 last year.
We can't be sure what's inside them, but this is what the drug looks like.
And the strength of pills has never been higher.
Consistently over the last 2 or 3 years, young women under the age of 21 are 2 to 3 times more likely than men to seek treatment.
Hi Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm fine.
Michelle's daughter Stephanie died in June.
She was so excited to be going to this new rave, because they only ever go to maybe 1 or 2 a year, if that. It was always just stay safe, come home and don't be stupid. Don't do nothing stupid.
Can you tell me how you found out what had happened?
I got a phone call about 10 to 1. It was a nurse on the end of the line. I just said, can you tell me if it's serious? She did say, we're working on it at the moment, they're working on it hard. Unfortunately, they couldn't save her. I was just, all of us in disbelief. Just, it hasn't happened. I'm going to wait for her to walk in the door.
You said Steph was really excited about this rave. I guess she'd been to stuff like that before. Did you know that she'd taken drugs before?
I didn't know 100%, but I had the feeling. They go there to get high, they go and have a good time and dance and not do any harm.
Every weekend in the UK, 500,000 people are taking ecstasy, but death is very rare.
Guys, have your IDs out ready, please!
The Warehouse Project in Manchester hosts 2,000 people every Friday and Saturday night for 3 months of the year.
Any promoter or any venue owner or any festival organiser that says there isn't drugs inside the venue, they're a liar.
Have you seen a change in the kind of stuff that you've had coming through here?
We've seen, definitely, I'd say over the last 2 years specifically, the strength of tabblers has increased 4 or 5 times what it used to be. Now if they take 3, 4, 5 tabblers, they're only going to go home one way, and that's in the back of an ambulance, if not worse.
How much do you know about medically what happened to Steph?
I think it was a little Lego man they had, and then the effects didn't take, so they all went back in and decided to take the other half, and it must have worked, because when we got to the hospital you could clearly see one of the girls was still high as a kite, and it wasn't nice at all to see.
Did they tell you, apart from the amount that was in her system, they tell you what happened to her body? Like,
all I know is the night it happened is just Steph had a substantial amount of water in her body.
Women are more likely to suffer this kind of reaction. Adam Winstock from the Global Drug Survey has been examining the data on young women and pills. Do you think that there's a difference in the way that females and males respond to ecstasy?
Yes, absolutely. Women are much less likely to buy their own drugs, so they perhaps don't know what they're taking, or they're taking pills or powders given to them on trust from men they may or may not know. Women are much more likely to end up in emergency medical treatment than men, at least 2 to 3-fold. That's not related to body weight. And the sorts of things that women present with when they turn up to the emergency department are different to men.
So if women are more susceptible to the negative effects, but it's not related to their body weight, then what is it?
So one thing you've got to look at is possibly hormones.
Ecstasy makes your body hold on to water. This can be dangerous when it leads to something called hyponatremia. The excess water in your system makes your cells swell, which can cause massive damage in the brain. Cells have pumps on them which can reduce the swelling. The estrogen makes these pumps work less well, meaning women are more likely to run into problems from hyponatremia.
One of the things that probably places people at risk of dehydration and overheating is having too much MDMA hit their brain at once.
Why is it that pills now contain so much more MDMA than they used to?
So there's new precursors, which are the chemicals you need to make MDMA, so it's easier to make. And manufacturers who are coming in to the marketplace kind of want to have a flagship product that's saying, we are here is our 330 milligram pill. And it's really unfortunate that manufacturers want to enter the marketplace with a product that's actually quite dangerous.
So one of the reasons that you'll see there where Adam Winstock was talking about some of the factors, and he said one of the things we have to think about is hormones, and there was a reason why he wasn't very conclusive about that, and it's because so little research has been done into the effects of mixing drugs with different hormones and the effects of drugs on women's bodies, especially for younger teenage women, and even things like interactions with the contraceptive pill. And this actually feeds much more widely into an issue that we see around things like, we might have heard the term, things like medical misogyny, the ignorance of female bodies, or this idea that the world is built to men for men, because actually when we think of the safety mechanisms, other harm reduction mechanisms that we have in the world, such as airbags, crash test dummies, stab-proof vests, these are all actually measured against male experience of the male body. Even when we look at things like temperatures in offices and workplaces, it's designed for the basal temperature of men. So this is a much wider issue, and it's one that kind of ties into pharmaceutical research as well. So actually when clinical trials are going on for new pharmaceuticals, we will often not have a lot of women included in clinical trials, and that is often to do with this concept that we shouldn't be doing things that might affect women's fertility, so they don't take part in clinical trials as often. So we know very little compared to what we know about the way that drugs work in other people's bodies, as in comparison to the way that we do for people who menstruate. So that is just something to consider, that when we're looking at this, actually we don't know enough, and we've only just started to question, why are we seeing an increase in women who die after taking MDMA? Why is that happening? We've only started to question that in the past few years. So I think it's important to think about some specific harm reduction kind of actions that women might want to consider, women and non-binary people as well. So when we're thinking about that, increased risk is there, and we can't quite put our finger on why, but there's some things that we can say. So if we're thinking about basic harm reduction, we'd say spend at least 2 hours researching any drugs that you're planning on to take. Get really familiar with the dose, the effects, the signs of an overdose, understanding the risks of mixing. Try and handle drugs yourself, weigh your own doses, administer your own doses, try to make sure that you are in control of that experience. Avoid taking drugs by yourself. Think about who you do want to be with. You want to be with people you trust. You'll see in that video, Adam mentioned that often women might be given drugs by someone that they don't know that well. That's quite common. Avoid mixing drugs. If you do decide to mix, take way less of each drug than you would if you were doing it by the drugs by themselves. Let people know how much you've taken and when. That's a really important thing, so then people can get help for you. Plan your dosing experience in advance, and think about what experience you're looking for. Think about sex as well. And the number one thing is that if there is an emergency, always call 999 straight away. Don't worry about the fact that drugs are illegal. Actually, the police are much more concerned about people's well-being in these situations. And if something goes really wrong and you haven't called an ambulance, then the police are going to come. So always just call 999 to get the emergency services there. And so just touching on this point, so we don't know enough, but do consider things like where are you in your hormonal cycle if you're someone who gets periods, and people who menstruate are at greater risk from when taking drugs depending on hormonal changes. So often as well, people might not be aware of how their estrogen levels fluctuate. But in general, when people are drinking things like alcohol, they might feel the effects much more strongly when they are actually bleeding. And then at the time of ovulation as well, there might be a greater risk from stimulant drugs. But it's an area that needs to be researched more. So it's important to think about if you are taking drugs with people who don't get periods, think about how you might want to reduce the dose in comparison to them. One thing that was mentioned in that video as well was this idea of water retention. So people who experience hormonal cycle like that are much more likely to experience water retention. We have an article on the Crew website that goes into detail to explain what was kind of touched on in that video with the little animation. So if you want to read more about that in specific reference to MDMA, the active drug in ecstasy tablets, then head over to our website and search for MDMA and phantom Ps. And it just explains this idea that your body might be naturally retaining more water. When you take a drug like MDMA, it tells your brain that you're thirsty, you need more water, so it gives you the urge to drink. But also at the same time, it tells your body, oh, there's not enough water inside, so we need to trap more inside. So if you either don't pee, or when you do, it's more concentrated urine. So that can lead to your blood becoming overly diluted and puts you at risk of water intoxication, which is what it sounds like was being described in that video that happened to the woman's daughter, sadly. Just going to spend the next few minutes as well just talking about sex and drugs, because I think this is a kind of important thing that comes up, and one that as we move out of lockdown, we're all going to have to come to understand the concept of consent in different ways. Some people are going to be really happy to have physical contact again. Some people are going to be actually quite apprehensive about it, and some people might not want to hug, want to touch, and we're going to have to, as a society, I think, navigate new understandings about consent. And when we're talking about consent, a lot of the time when drugs are involved, this can maybe become a bit of a more difficult topic to bring up for some people. So it's good to have a discussion about sex and consent before you're taking drugs, chat about what you feel comfortable with, and what to do if anybody stops feeling comfortable or thinks that actually I'm too high, the effects of the drugs are too strong, and I'm not kind of feeling this anymore. If you or your partner begin to feel too high or uncomfortable in any way, just stop. It happens, it's not a big deal, and the best way to respond to that situation is through communication. So that's a kind of a good thing to bear in mind. And it's also important to think about when you take drugs, sex can feel different. If you've taken drugs and had sex before, your body and your brain might respond differently this time, even if it's the same drug, the same dose. Feelings good or bad can be intensified, so take time to check in with yourself and any partners. Long-term use of drugs can lead to an increase in tolerance, so that means that it will take more of a drug to get the same effects, so bear that in mind as well. Think about your dose as well. So what might work for you might be overwhelming or even risky for other people. You have to remember that you have the right to choose whether you take drugs or not, and to ask about the content and the dose and the effects, and to do your own research. And actually, it's your choice at all times. Allowing other people to judge a dose for you can be risky, especially if they are making the assumption that it will have the same effect on you as it did on them. And it's everybody's responsibility to make sure that nobody's taking something without their consent. So nobody should ever be adding someone into someone's drink or other drugs, or giving someone a pill or powder pretending that it's something else. So that's everyone's responsibility to not do that. It's not the responsibility of the person whose drink it is. Obviously they should look after their drink and try and avoid something getting put inside it, but it's everyone else's responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. Think about contraception, any barrier methods, what will you need to protect yourself, and think about getting tested regularly. And you can find out more information about how to access STI and bloodborne virus testing across Scotland by doing a research online, and also you can have a look on our website for information. Think about any contraception. If you're taking the contraceptive pill, if you vomit or experience diarrhea, this can affect the effectiveness of the contraceptive pill. So it might be that you want to get emergency contraception, which could be in the form of the emergency contraceptive pill, or it could be in the form of a coil. So you can get an emergency pill up to 72 hours after having sex, and a coil can be fitted, an IUD, as it's also known, can be fitted up to 5 days after you've had sex. One thing as well is don't forget lube. Stimulant drugs can, in particular, can reduce natural lubrication. So if you are planning on having sex after you've taken drugs, think about adding lube into that experience as well, which also helps prevent cuts and tears, and just will make things a better experience for you. Important thing to remember as well is under UK law, a person can't consent to sex while under the influence of drugs, including alcohol. So it's important to, while people are sober, confirm that everybody's interested in having sex, state your limits, and make a clear safety plan of what to do if someone feels unwell, it stops feeling good, it feels unsafe, or even somebody might not know how to communicate it properly. Like, what way can they communicate it if they don't feel comfortable doing it verbally? Is there another agreement you can come to? And do look out for the new resource that we're going to have from Crew, which covers consent. So that is going to be launching in the next week or so on our social media channels, and you'll be able to download that. So just thinking about this idea that the drug use is a feminist issue, that harm reduction strategies actually, we have to think of new harm reduction strategies for women, and maybe some specific things. And what else can we do? We can agitate for change. So we can think about all of those different socioeconomic factors that were mentioned at the start when we were chatting. Those are things that we can agitate for change around. We can agitate for change around the funding to services and how services are delivered. We can challenge this idea of carceral feminism, and that's an entire different concept that we could spend another hour talking about. But this is this idea of moving away from people being imprisoned, and seeing that that is going to solve the problems and the social violences that women experience. Improve all services for women, so looking at mental health services, looking at employability services, looking at housing services, and actually having focused harm reduction interventions that are designed for women. So things like a place where a woman could go with her children, a place where there are employment opportunities that are specifically designed for different women's needs. And in really what we need to do as well is make sure that women who take drugs actually have a voice, and they're involved in service design to minimise the impact of stigma. So just a little bit as well before we go to any questions that people might have, is a little bit about what we've been doing during the lockdown period. So as an organisation that I work for, we're working more closely with NHS Inform, the NHS 24 website. So they've got lots of information about drugs on the NHS website now, and then links to local services. So if you do have questions about drugs, that's a good place to go, or to signpost people to. We've also been doing a big survey to look at how drug use has changed over this period of lockdown. So we found out that nearly 60% of people are taking drugs more often, and when they are, they're taking a greater amount. We find that people are seeing that products are not being available, which leads us to maybe have concerns about the quality of products that are on the market. So it might be that things are more likely to have unexpected contents, or maybe products being sold as something and people thinking they're something else. So that's increasing the risk for people. We also find that some people are experiencing withdrawal, not being able to get prescriptions. But one of the kind of key things we've seen is that more than 65% of people have experienced anxiety about the impact of lockdown, and that people were struggling to get support. So if we think that there's already additional barriers for women, and especially those with childcare responsibilities and accessing support, we can imagine that actually the impact of lockdown maybe increased that for them. A little bit of information from some other surveys that were going on over the past 4 months. We found that from this survey from the Loop, 2 in 5 people report that they would usually take ketamine, have been taking ketamine during lockdown, and actually they were twice as likely to not practice harm reduction and actually be sharing equipment like snorting tubes, and also twice as likely to use the same tube. So for that reason, we're really encouraging anyone who is going to be taking drugs to keep an eye on their use, wash their hands before and after handling or preparing drugs, wipe down the bag or packaging, avoid sharing drugs from the same baggie as someone else, clean the surface you're going to prepare drugs on with an alcohol wipe if possible, and avoid sharing the same snorting tube. If you're looking for a chat about drugs, or you're looking for any support, we normally have that physical drop-in that I mentioned at the start. It's moved online, so you can get in touch with our drop-in team by emailing drop-in@crew2000.org.uk, or finding us on Instagram at crew_2000, or go on our website for more information. We've been producing loads of specific harm reduction information about the changes, the way that people's relationship with drugs, including alcohol, might have changed over this period of lockdown. Some people might not have had access to the drugs they were normally taking, and some people might have been taking more. So if you've been taking less drugs than you normally would, it's really important to remember that now, as pubs are opening back open and everything, actually, whereas you normally might have had 2 glasses of wine or 2 pints of beer, you might feel the effects more strongly from just 1 pint of beer, and that's the same with all other drugs as well. So actually a much lower dose would be something that people might think about. And if people have been taking more drugs than usual, then actually you might be thinking about what your new relationship with drugs, including alcohol, means. So definitely have a look at our website for these resources and get in touch with us. Some other things that we did, we made a kind of colouring book for people to relax, some specific information about taking cannabis during lockdown or by yourself, some specific information about drinking, about sleep, about taking drugs alone, and specific information about the risk of the spread of the coronavirus when people are taking drugs in a social setting. One thing that we were doing as an organisation at Crew before lockdown, which we've had to put on pause, was that we were offering free mental health first aid training to people who take drugs. This is something that I'm really hoping we'll be able to start back up as soon as possible, because this is a really amazing course. It's an NHS accredited course, so you get a certificate and you get to say you're a mental health first aider. And I'm really hoping that we can start offering this again for free to people who take drugs, and it would be really amazing to have a whole bunch of feminist women who are, and non-binary people who are going to take that back to their community of other people who take drugs. So please do get in touch if you are interested in that. There's my email address, it's kira@crew2000.org.uk. You can find me on Twitter, you can find me on Instagram, and you can find Crew across all social media platforms and through the website crew.scot. If you are looking for further support, these are a few key services that would be a really good place for any women and gender non-conforming people looking to get support to go to. So Scottish Families Affected by Alcohol and Drugs, they have a phone support line. They offer lots of different services. Scottish Women's Aid for anyone who might be experiencing any kind of coercion and so on. The Scottish Drug Services Directory, so you can find your closest drug service, and the Scottish Women's Rights Centre, which give legal advice to women if you're looking for any information at all. And I'll just leave you with the kind of tagline that Crew has had for the past 25 years. It's about taking drugs seriously. So definitely we need to take women's drug use more seriously and make sure that we are acknowledging that this is a feminist issue and that we can do much better in creating a safe environment for women to come, and a non-judgmental and non-stigmatizing environment for women to come and talk about drug use openly, and be happy to share their experiences, so we can actually find out more about what are the different risks that women are experiencing, because anecdotally we'll hear all kinds of different things around, oh, if I take MDMA at this point in my cycle it makes my periods more painful, actually I've had this experience of coercion, I've had this experience of LGBT phobia, and even things like I went to buy drugs and then the drug dealer was trying to offer me free drugs in exchange for sex, was trying to ask me out on a date. And these are all issues that we need to explore in much more detail and find better ways to respond to.